Hello, folks. Welcome to the Crime Dawg podcast. I'm your host, Johnny FIORICA, retired detective with the Rochester, New York Police Department after serving 30 years. Sitting alongside me, David Simpson, also a retired detective with the Rochester, New York Police Department after serving 22 plus years. Folks, we sit before you today with a wealth of knowledge and a ton of experience, but if you want to know more about what David and I did over the course of our careers, you could check our bios out on our YouTube channel, or you could check them out on our website, thecrimedogpodcast.com. While you're there, check out our cool merch store. David, welcome to the podcast, brother. We got a hot one today.
We need a hot one. It's freezing out.
I know, right? We were obviously in text messages and text threads with our producer, Danny Agnew, late last night. You and him were totally in agreement with us having to do a episode on the presidential pardons. I have to warn the audience that because this is a relatively new topic and a ton of specifics are not out yet, especially the individual pardons. That's what I'm talking about, what each person did. So we may talk generally and do a follow-up podcast, but here we go today. So David, in the first hours of his second term, President Trump pardoned nearly everyone convicted of crimes associated with the Jan 6 incident at the U.S. Capitol in 2021. Some reports say that 1,600 people have been charged, 1,300 have been convicted of crimes on that day, and there are still about 300 plus cases that are unresolved. The interesting thing is that there was about 379 of those people that have been charged with felony assault. Again, we don't know what the extent of that felony assault encompasses. Most of them have been convicted already. Some have served multiple years of jail time. But either way, David, there were a couple things that happened yesterday. There were pardons and there were commutations. So just so our audience knows, a pardon essentially wipes away the offense and restores the constitutional rights of that person convicted of a felony or misdemeanor. Okay, that's a pardon. A commutation means essentially that the sentence was too harsh. The commutation could either let somebody out of jail immediately and terminate their sentence, or it could shorten the amount of time remaining. So basically, a commutation, you don't have your constitutional rights restored in some or most instances. You can't vote still. You can't possess a firearm, et cetera, et cetera. Pardons wipe out everything. David, what's going on in your head regarding these things?
Well, first of all, 99% of what the president signed off on, I was in full agreement with as far as all the executive orders. This one's a little more complicated. You're right. We don't have all the details down to each individual. So I can, like I said, we're speaking a little bit in generalities. I would say that 90 to 95% of the people that are pardoned or going to be pardoned, in my opinion, should be pardoned. I feel like they've served time. I feel like for vandalism and trespassing, the conviction and the time they served was just. And I think any more time they would have to serve, it would be unjust in comparison to other people, like those involved with Black Lives Matter and things of that nature that have been either not prosecuted or certainly not prosecuted to this extent. However, there's a small percentage that if individuals were involved with causing, an assault's a very loose term. We know that from being a police officer. We've been punched in the face, gotten a little bruise, and that's an assault. Do I think someone should go to prison for 3 to 5 years for that? Absolutely not. Now, if you cause serious physical injury to somebody, that is something that you should go to prison for. And I just don't know the details of that. I'm going on the assumption that there's individuals within the pardons that did cause serious physical injury. And I have to look at how much time they served to speak on those specific individuals. But, I know it's a little bit of gray area. I agree with 95%. I have to see the specifics on the other ones. I know that the narrative that police officers were killed that day is a total bullshit lie. That did not happen. No cops were killed. And it's very difficult to even search and find what officers had serious physical injuries. It's very vague and very general. So that's my first take on this, and I don't want to go too long on it, so I'm going to kick it back to you.
Here's what I love most about it. Okay, so we're going to stand on our line like we usually do. If you assault a cop, you should be held responsible. Again, what we're trying to say is each incident is, you can't throw a blanket over it. So you have to look at individually how they were assaulted, to what extent were the officer's injuries, the officer's subject factors, how big was the suspect, how small was the officer, or vice versa. At the same time, there's a lot of factors that go into those assaults. We've been involved in cases like that. We've investigated suspects that assaulted police officers. So we're very well versed in those crimes in New York State. So what we're saying is that, we have to look at individual cases, which I don't know to the extent of what the Trump team did to look at the individual cases that were involved. So here's what I want to say. The biggest thing I want to point out is I love how these liberal news outlets and politicians, and we got local politicians here in Rochester, New York too, David, that are exploiting the old "I love cops now" pretty much line. Cops were assaulted. They jump on the bandwagon, and that's what I love. During the 2020 BLM riots, you couldn't see one of these liberal networks or politicians, local, state, or federal, standing with law enforcement. Now, all of a sudden, they're waving the flag of law enforcement, and they want to jump on the backs of cops. They're totally politicizing these pardons, and we knew they would. And now they're saying, "Oh my God, look at this guy. He's anti-cop now, Trump. He's anti-cop." Bullshit. That's not the case. He's not anti-cop. But these pardons do heed a little bit of a warning to law enforcement in the fact that we have to look at the individual cases. You know what I mean? I'm totally going to dive right in as soon as they release the numbers and stats on this, because I'll tell you right now, the politicians that exploited us during the 2020 riots don't get a free pass here. And speaking of politicians, David, you and I, great minds think alike. We wouldn't even be talking about this. I had handwritten notes on our outline today. That scumbag trash Nancy Pelosi and that scumbag trash Muriel Bowser, the mayor of D.C., okay, both had the opportunity because Trump offered it. We wouldn't even be talking about this right now because they were offered the National Guard. They were offered the National Guard to come in, stand ready, and it was turned down by Pelosi and Muriel Bowser. And that's the part that pisses me off the most.
Right. They didn't give a care in the world to protecting the cops that day and supporting them in numbers. And they definitely had the intel because we know of all the FBI sources that were on the ground that day. And they had, I'm sure, information flowing to the FBI previous to that day. And they did nothing. And taking a step back, there is no Democratic politician that cares at all about police officers. Let's just say it what it is. They care about violent criminals. They're in bed with violent criminals, okay?
Yep.
This coming out and saying that cops were assaulted and how could Trump do this, it is totally political. They don't give a shit about the police. They haven't since the 2019, 2020 riots. We have cop killers that are getting paroled in New York State. And then Chuck Schumer wants to come on and say how he's, appalled that police officers were assaulted and people are getting pardoned.
Yeah.
You don't even hold people and push the politicians of New York to hold people accountable for their actions against law-abiding citizens in New York. Yet you're going to go and say that police officers that were, pushed around, most of them should spend years in jail. It's absurd. Just taking politics and putting it ahead of common sense. That's all they're doing. They're taking this moment and they're just using it to grandstand. And that's why they always interject that cops were killed that day, and they produce these lies because it supports their false narrative.
The BLM riots lasted 7 months. Jan 6 lasted a few hours, okay? There was about $2 billion with a B damage to buildings and property, and there was about $1 million with an M damaged during the Jan 6. David, I do want to say this, though. We got cops coming out, the cops that were assaulted. Look at individuals. We're all for mental health, too, right? We're all for mental health. We're all for, we did an episode with Dr. Kim Butler about police officer mental health. Incidents affect cops in different ways. So I'm not saying that there are some Washington, D.C. Capitol Police that were affected by this. I get it. I understand that. However, I will say this, which I've said before. if you're involved in something that affects you to the point where you can't do your job anymore, I apologize. I've said this publicly and privately. Then I think it's time for you to move on.
It's a dangerous game.
It's a dangerous game. We know that. You know that. We all know that. We were involved in riots. We were involved in massive, large crowd gatherings that were extremely violent, over the course of our careers. We were involved in incidents where we've been rocked and bottled, and that's police terminology for we've had huge 40-ounce beer bottles thrown at our heads. We've had rocks thrown at us. We've been involved in riots over the course of our careers. They're massive events where people have gathered for some reason. It could be a festival. It could be some kind of gathering. And guess what happens? Fights break out, and they're literally riots. They're mini riots. So we've been involved. So we know what it's like to be involved in incidents like these. Okay, everyone's going to come, they're going to come at us and go, well, you were involved in where the Capitol was being stormed. Okay, no, we weren't. Okay, there's one Capitol. It's in Washington, D.C. We worked in upstate New York, but we live in a very violent area. Per capita, Rochester, New York is one of the most violent cities in America. Look it up.
I think it comes down to what reasonableness is. And these pardons, people are just throwing blanket statements out, mostly from the left and from the Democrats, and can't support police only when it's convenient for you and your politics. Okay. Most of these people have not given a shit about police officers, and now they do because Trump put pen to paper. We at Crime Dawg want to look at the individual sentences and the crimes for which they were convicted of before we sit there and accuse the president of, letting people that committed serious physical injury to police officers go scot-free. I haven't seen that. And until I do, I'm going to take the notion that 95% of the people that he pardoned probably should have been pardoned. Okay. I think they were probably overcharged, and I think they were certainly over-sentenced based on a comparison to people that are involved in similar incidents, obviously not at the Capitol, but in society in general. So I guess we're kind of taking a wait-and-see approach, but the big thing I wanted to get out there was that a majority of the stuff he has done related to the pardons we agree with, or I agree with. And we certainly don't agree with the politicians on the left who haven't supported the police at all. Okay, they've done everything but support the police. Now they want to get on their soapbox. They can kiss my ass.
Yeah, David, they definitely could kiss our ass. I'll tell you another thing that we talked about during our live show, shameless plug, Crime Dawg live show on iHeartRadio, Google's it, where we talk live on the radio every Saturday from noon to 1. David, we talked about Christopher Wray, former FBI director, explaining how they had, quote unquote, 26 sources on the ground. That's interesting. 26 sources. When he was asked, did you have undercover FBI agents? And he wouldn't really talk. He was vague. He was evasive. You and I delved very deep into what we call sources, CIs, CSs, confidential informants, confidential sources. You and I both ran with confidential sources, confidential informants. Those terms are used synonymously. Those are civilian people that work for law enforcement, okay? In most instances, they're either working off their charges or they're getting paid by that law enforcement arm. The FBI had 26 sources on the ground during this incident, okay? And when I say they had 26 sources, I would love to see the reports, okay? Because there's rumors now that there's missing information on their Jan 6 reports. There's rumors that they have shredded Ollie North style some information. They have gotten rid of video, because I want to see what these 26 sources did. Were they part of the insurrection, so to speak? Were they part of the sedition? Were they part of railing up the crowd? Because when you have 26 sources on the ground, that's a lot of people that you can control. David, from working informants, when you send them into an incident, right? They are directed by us. They're goal driven. We say we want you to do X, Y, and Z. That's what we tell our informants. I want to know what the FBI under Christopher Wray told these informants when they went into the crowd on Jan 6th.
I'll second that, but I'll also say that I want to know what they knew before, because I think it goes again to what did the FBI, what did Pelosi, what did the mayor know with reasonable certainty was talked about, planned, and coming that day? Because a reasonable, intelligent person who is in a leadership position that has intelligence information from confidential sources saying people are coming to Washington, they're rallying, they're pissed off, and you need to be prepared. I don't really know what's going to happen. Even that alone, you should have taken the president up on his offer of having the National Guard. And the fact that you didn't, then you have to ask the question, why is that? Okay. Is that because you wanted stuff to get out of control so you could then 100%. Pin it on the president? Or are you just terrible at your job? Okay. Because it's either or. Okay. Right. You're either terrible at your job and totally incompetent for that position, or you had the information and you just didn't care because you wanted to see how it would play out and how you could politicize it, which is what happened. So we have to back up. It's not just the intel that day. They had the intel that day, but they also were getting intel weeks before from these same sources.
Sure.
And they had that information, and I'm sure it was passed along to leadership, and they did nothing. They did nothing to help out the Capitol Police.
You're 100% right. They definitely had the information and the intel prior to the incident, because they wouldn't have formulated their 26 sources to put them in the crowd if they hadn't had that intel, number one. Number two, they definitely had informants inside of the Oath Keepers, inside of the Proud Boys, inside of these factions that they're calling extreme right-wing activists. So they definitely had the information. It's a matter of, like you said, how they utilized it. They definitely utilized it to their advantage. It's not a conspiracy theory. You know, like we said at the beginning of this podcast, filth bag, trash bag Nancy Pelosi and Muriel Bowser had the ability to stop this whole mess before it happened, and they chose not to do it. Folks, listen, if you enjoyed this episode, click like and subscribe. Also, check us out on our website at thecrimedawgpodcast.com. Like I already said, if you can't get enough of us, you can check us out on iHeartRadio. It's under Crime Dawg Live Show, the Crime Dawg Live Show. That's DAWG. We are live every Saturday, and we also have past recordings from previous episodes. You can check us out there. Thank you for listening to the Crime Dawg Podcast. We hope you stick with us for future episodes. But like my brother-in-law, Frankie Grassi, says, if you can't make it, who cares?